to brief introductions. First of all, I'm Marty Horswill, for any of you who aren't from Nelson or have come to Nelson in the last 6 years while I've been away. I've been working for CUSO first in Africa and more recently in Papua New Guinea, and have just returned to Nelson this month. So it's a pleasure and a very interesting coincidence that this forum should be taking place for me just at the time that I return to Nelson. The other participants this morning are Jean Davidson, who is with the Presbyterian World Service. Lois Wilson, who I think doesn't need any introduction. You've been introduced 2 or 3 times previously. Murray Thomson, who's been chairing the sessions and whom I'm standing in for so he can have his say this morning, is the founder of Ploughshares and executive director of the organization that I worked for some years back. And Gay de Montreuil, I'm afraid that I don't know too much about you, Gay, except that you have some association with the Philippines and will be speaking to us today on that. And Angelina Horswill, my wife of 1 week, who I met through my work in CUSO and who has worked in the CUSO office for 15 years. Now that was last Saturday, Russ. You missed out on that. So, the order of the speakers today, Murray Thomson will begin.
Thank you, Marty. Having been rudely telling people they only had 8 or 9 minutes, I now suffer that same fate, so I will be talking as fast as I can about militarism and the peace movement in Southern Asia. There are more than half the world's population living in Asia, and a majority of the large wars of the 20th century have been fought there. Military governments are in charge of or dominant parts of the majority of countries in that continent. So the characteristics of the peace movement will reflect this to some extent. It is not easy to be a peacemonger in most countries of Asia. The movement is diffuse. The emphasis is on environmental issues, for the most part, on development and justice issues, and on human rights. But increasingly, there is a concern about the spread of militarism and a concern for disarmament. One of the basic needs which they have is that of legitimacy, of security. Am I too close? Not close enough. Good. I'm just going to very quickly give a few snapshots of some of the organizations and some of the things that are happening to my knowledge, particularly in Southern Asia, with an emphasis on Thailand, which is a country that I know the best. It is difficult to advocate conventional disarmament in India today, although there are groups that are doing it, or even to approve or to oppose a nuclear role for India. There is an Indian campaign for nuclear disarmament. There is the Gandhi Peace Foundation and the Sarvodaya movement. There is a group in India for nuclear disarmament, and there is a new Center for Peace and Justice being set up on Cape Comorin, the most southern tip of India, which will, of course, be concerned not only with Indian peace issues, but also with its relationships with Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka, the only one that I really know anything about is the Center for Society and Religion. It's ecumenical, and it's been doing a valiant job of trying to bring about reconciliation and better understanding between the Sinhalese and the Tamils in that country. There is a Sri Lanka Catholic Studies movement and the Christian Workers Fellowship. And there are others, but those are some of the few that I've been familiar with. There is no, that I know of, peace movement per se in Malaysia, but there is a strong emphasis on environmental concerns, such as organizations like Friends of the Earth, the Third World Network, and the Consumers Association of Penang. In Indonesia, there is a new organization called the Forum on Peace and Development Ethics, and it promises to be an important one in Indonesia. There is also an Institute for Social and Economic Research that is concerned with peace-related issues, an organization called YAS, which is focusing on women's concerns, again relating to peace. In the Philippines, there are a large number of organizations, and perhaps we'll hear more about them from my colleague on my left. I'm familiar with the Ecumenical Movement for Justice and Peace and the Ecumenical Centre for Development in Quezon City. In Hong Kong, there's an important organization called Asia Regional Exchange for New Alternatives. They put out an excellent magazine with articles on peace-related subjects, which is available to people who are interested. I'm going to focus now my remaining few minutes mostly on Thailand, where I was just a few days ago. There is a young political scientist, remarkable young man, who teaches nonviolence at Thammasat University. Recently married a young Buddhist lecturer at another university, and together they put out a remarkable document called Struggling Dove and Plastic Lotus, Peacemaking in Thai Society. He wrote the first half and she wrote the second half, and she disagrees with some of the things which he said in the first half. I tend to think she was right on some of her statements. But in this, there is an interesting description, I'm going to read a couple paragraphs from it, of the recent development of the peace movement in Thailand. This is the way they wrote. One day in late 1983, a young active political scientist student by the name of Phuong Thong Ruang Sawatdi walked into my office, the third person, but it's my office, and we began to talk. That time, I was giving a course on violence and nonviolence in politics at the Faculty of Political Science. Ms. Ruang Sawatdi, vice president of the Thammasat Students' Union, pointed out to her teacher, that is to me, that given the ubiquity of violent problems in the world, to simply sit comfortably and give a course on peace once or twice a year to a handful of students was far from adequate. She urged me to extend myself beyond the confinement of classroom walls and began the peace crusade. She promised that students would come in and see to it that peace activities were properly carried out. Considering all the odds, rationality suggested it was wiser for me not to embark on such a difficult road, with the potentiality of jeopardizing my own career. But since rationality has not always been the sole arbiter of human action, I chose to undertake the task. And together we initiated Peace Week of 1984. Well, I thought you'd be interested in that as one little piece of how certain kinds of things begin. They so often begin with individual initiatives, although the conditions are there, and many other people have been involved in the peace movement in Thailand in the past. I remember in 1973, 400,000 students opposed the military dictatorship of the time, went out on the streets, they were there for a week, and they brought about, with the support of the king, the expulsion of the three top military commanders in Thailand. It was a very remarkable time when the Boy Scouts were running the streets of the city for 3 weeks. Another example of how some initiatives were taken in the north of Thailand, a few years ago, 2 young CUSO volunteers and a Thai YMCA director sat having coffee together and said, why don't we respond to the needs of the youth in the northern part of the country, in Chiang Mai, and try to extend the YMCA into that part of the country? They said, but we don't have any money. And they were sitting in a deserted shop at the time in Chiang Mai, and they said, well, how much have we got? And they looked into their pockets. Each of them had the equivalent of 50 cents. So they plunked their 10 bahts, their 50 cents down each, and they started the Chiang Mai YMCA. They took some red cardboard, cut out a Y, an M, a C, and an A, and pasted them on the windows of the old deserted shop. That's how that particular thing began, with $1.50. Today they have a program of development work, youth, women, action, peace action, community action in 9 provinces of the north. And a modern YMCA that I stayed in for about $5 a night, and a very remarkable program involving exchanges between Thai students and Lao students. And this is not an easy thing to do when the Lao and the Thai have been shooting across the Mekong River periodically over the last 5 years. They also developed an international work camp, which was held up in the northeast part of the country, and are looking at trying to develop better relations with Burma and some of the other countries. Well, this is crucially important because, as you know, a major war has been fought in Southeast Asia, and the relations between the Vietnamese, the Cambodians, the Lao, and the rest of the part of the area are not very good. The potential for danger is considerable, and so the peace movement, what these young people do, and they're mostly young people, is, I believe, crucially important for the future of Asia and the future of the world. A third example is the Preeti Peace Foundation, which was initiated recently in memory of Preeti Panomyang, who was one of the founders of modern Thai society, one of the civilians. They have developed a number of studies. Here are some of the studies for $500 each. They're doing studies that nobody else will do. Concepts of Peace by the Rural Children Living in Northeast Thailand. This, again, is the most underdeveloped part of the country. What kind of peace education is suitable for Thai universities? Violence in the comics read by Thai children. How are conflicts resolved in the slum communities of Bangkok? Contributions of Thai lawyers to peace and justice, and the use of the Thai media for promoting or opposing peaceful relations with other countries. Finally, I mentioned yesterday, I think, I didn't actually witness it. I have the pictures of a demonstration against a major defense arms bazaar held in Bangkok. This was initiated by these students in a magnificent combination of posters, acting out, and individual contacts with the people, the thousands of people who were in that particular area. In conclusion of this very brief sketch, I want to point out that the emerging movement there will be mainly, of course, the movement of Asians. But since peace and peace issues are interrelated and international, anything that we can do to help is crucially important. There are two things we can do to help. One, most important, is we can stop or reduce our arms exports to Asian countries. Canada this past year has spent $2 billion worth approximately of arms exports. Much of that goes to the United States, but some of it goes out to Asian countries. Every year in March, we bring all of our trade commissioners together to Ottawa to maximize the possibility of arms contracts in countries like the ones I've been talking about. That's a major contribution we could make to the peace movement of Asia. Secondly, where it is relevant and possible, we can support through our finances and through other ways, through helping to legitimize, making the contacts with the United Nations and so on, these efforts which are going on, which are so important for the development of Asia. Thanks.
Thank you, Murray. Okay.
Perhaps I'd better introduce myself. I'm from Kelowna, and I've been involved in various development groups for the last 15 years, I guess. Interchurch committees mainly, and development of peace, and recently CUSO, so I feel like I'm in good company here. My experience of the Philippines is a little dated, but I have tried to keep up with things through various avenues which are open to all of us. One I'd just like to mention at the first is the BC Committee for Human Rights in the Philippines, which was started following our exposure tour. And if anyone is interested in following up on that, I can get them the address. From January to May in Davao, on the island of Mindanao, there are many human rights violations reported in these various publications. 40 people were arrested, 8 people killed, and relocation of more than 2,000 families. It sort of sounds like the Marcos era, but this was 1987. A lot of people figure that since Cory Aquino came in that perhaps things are a lot better in the Philippines, but we have had reports to the contrary. It's sort of like the more things change, the more they stay the same, and that can be said about the Philippines. In February, when Cory Aquino, who was backed by the armed forces and people power, and he took over from Ferdinand Marcos, we all felt that there could be hope for democratic change. Around Manila, there has been some change, but as you get further away from Manila, things appear to be not too much different to when we were there. In fact, there are a lot of, in the rest of the country, there have been a lot of reports that have come in which sound very much like this report that we got from Davao City. According to the Philippine Human Rights Commission, there have been several hundred political killings of peasants since the February 86 revolution. To demonstrate what's been happening in the Philippines, I'd like to talk about three different areas, and one it would be the military and what their tactics are, and the U.S. involvement and land reform. 5 years ago, I visited Mindanao. It was on an exposure tour conducted by the churches, and we were hosted by NASA, which is the National Secretariat for Social Action of the Philippine Bishops. Things were tense, and human rights violations were rampant. But from these reports, the situation now seems to be much more frightening. The military, trying to preserve the image that they gained in the revolution, have introduced the low-intensity conflict, which came from the Central America. People live in fear of vigilante groups who penetrate the community, as the Army was never able to do, and they can pinpoint leaders of potential protest movements, of church social activists, and human rights advocates. These vigilantes, they're called Alsa-Masa, which is People's Uprising, Nakasaka, which is the People's Power, using this people's power thing to legitimize their actions. There's TAD and various other ones. Throughout the Philippines, there are different groups. This happens to be in Mindanao. They've become better organized in recent months, and this seems to be a phenomenon that's happening all over the Philippines. They're being better organized. They've got up-to-date equipment, such as 38 and 45 caliber weapons, hand grenades, and Armalites, CM16s. The military seems to be behind them, although they deny it. But the military will hold mass meetings in a community, and the people are urged to join the Alsa-Masa. And when they refuse, they're labeled as communists, and then they are open to harassment and intimidation by these groups of young people. Lieutenant Colonel Kalida, the Metropolitan District Commander of Davao, told members of a fact-finding mission recently, it is impossible for a resident who lives in Alsa-Masa territory not to signify his intention to support the organization. Otherwise, he will not be welcome in the community. Any salvagings, which is extrajudicial killing, have happened to people who ignore the invitation to join. The new constitution calls for the abolition of these paramilitary forces, but instead it is being actively promoted by local governments, and their numbers have increased with the income of the Aquino government, even surpassing the Marcos record. To go on to the U.S. involvement, I don't like to be accused of U.S. bashing, but unfortunately they do happen to be behind a lot of things that are going on in these countries. When I've listened here over the last day, I couldn't help but notice the similarity between what's happening in Central America, Africa, and the Philippines, and all the other countries probably as well. An independent fact-finding mission headed by former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark recently visited the Philippines, And the report issued June 9th condemned this low-intensity conflict carried out by the vigilante gangs against suspected leftists, church activists, and social justice advocates. The 6-person team accused the United States of sponsoring a coordinated covert action campaign to whip up anti-communist hysteria through the Philippines. This seems to be the main drive. Everybody is labeled communist, and then they're open to harassment and killing. The charges include clandestine U.S. support for organizing rightist vigilante and death squads, private support of the vigilantes by right-wing groups, and the distribution of anti-communist material from Sun Myung Moon's Unification Church. And this is done by the U.S. Information Agency. Among foreign groups and individuals named in the report as supporting the vigilantes are Causa International, which is the political arm of the Unification Church, and retired U.S. Army Major General John Singlaub, who is the one who admitted to getting arms to the Contras in Nicaragua, and the Christian Anti-Communism Campaign based in California. All these people and organizations deny any connection with the vigilantes or with each other. They don't even want to be associated with one another. General Singlaub claims his many visits to the Philippines, which included meetings with vigilante leaders and high-level military leaders, were to search for buried World War treasure left by the Japanese. Former Attorney General Clark commented, "Any American who believes General Singlaub is treasure hunting is naive beyond hope." Land reform. I think that is one of the most important issues in the Philippines at the moment. Cory Aquino just signed a bill introducing a land reform program. And here again we find the U.S. involvement. There's the KMP, which is the peasant movement of the Philippines, says that the land reform program was devised largely by the World Bank and an American expert, Roy Prosterman. Prosterman advised South Vietnam, El Salvador, and President Marcos on land reform. So you can take it from there how much the KMP will think of this. The Secretary General Rafael Mariano of the KMP says the land reform bill does not promote genuine land reform and is essentially pro-landlord and anti-farmer. I'm sure there's a lot more that could be said about the land reform bill. I could only speak to the need, the desperate need for this bill to listen, for the people to listen to the farmers, because they are the ones who need it so desperately. The first 2 phases encompass something like 3 million hectares of land, and this is supposed to satisfy around 2 million peasants. These are the first 2 phases of it, and that's as far as they have planned so far. I can't see that anybody in the Philippines, rich as the land is, who could make a living off of that. When you divide that up among all those farmers, how could they possibly, each farmer, make a living? And I think that in paying back, this is part of the land reform bill, that they have to pay back this at a certain percentage of interest. And I think the land would probably wind up back in the landlord's laps before too long. To finish off, I'd like to quote attorney, he was an attorney, Jose Diokno, who we heard when we were in the Philippines. He was a former senator, and this was many years ago. He died recently, but this was put out in January. And it says, What is freedom when there is no food, or justice when there are no jobs? A starving man does not have much freedom of choice, and there is no justice in poverty. Food without freedom, jobs without justice, would be like leaves without a tree. Food and freedom, jobs and justice, these are the keys to peace. One of his criteria for bringing this about, he said, is that these problems are ours and ours alone to resolve in a manner that our people so desire, and not as foreigners would want us to solve them, for the good of the many who are poor and not the few who are privileged. Okay. Thank you.
The light in my hotel room was flashing, indicating that I had a message at the desk, so I picked up the phone, and a voice at the other end said, "Did you have a nice trip to the country today, Mrs. Wilson? When did you get back?" And I said, I got back a long time ago. Who did you see in your trip to the country, Mrs. Wilson? I don't understand Korean very well, so I'll have to wait until I get an interpreter till I can talk to you crash. This was a little conversation that took place when I was part of the World Council delegation to visit South Korea in 1980. And it was my first encounter with government spies. First time I was followed, the first time I brought information out from a country for Amnesty International, and I was scared, to put it mildly. That particular day, I had, the country was under martial law at the time, which restricts movement and declares any gathering of over 5 people strictly illegal. I had gone to visit the provincial city of Gwangju out of Seoul, where, as some of you may know, in 1980 there was a massive massacre carried out by Korean troops, but with the backing of the U.S. Troops, in reprisal against the citizens of Gwangju and the students who had mounted a massive demonstration for the restoration of democracy in South Korea. Kim Dae-jung, who is and was one of the official leaders of the opposition, was accused of engineering that demonstration and was subsequently arrested, of course. I went because when we had an official reception on arrival, and of the 4 women present in that group of 100, they had come to me and asked that I come to Gwangju and visit, and that I should do that, and that was laid on me. I knew it was totally illegal, and when I mentioned it to the head of our delegation, he said, "Don't mention it to me, don't mention it to me." So I thought, oh. So finally I told him, I said, "I'm going. I have a United Church missionary who'll translate for me. I just thought you should know I'm going to break the law." And he said, he didn't say anything then. Later in the day, he said to me, "Okay, I'll back you up." Which he did. The way he backed me up is that when I got back to Seoul very late, first of all, when I went to Gwangju, it was the hardest pastoral visit I've ever paid in my life, because people had come from the countryside, relatives of young people who had been murdered in that massacre, and I had to listen to this. It was very difficult, and I knew that the secret police were outside waiting for us to come out of the meeting, and I remember the executive director of the Y, who looked even at that time as old as my grandmother, turned out to be one of the main places of resistance to that whole thing. And she told me that she vacated her office in the Y when the second floor was turned into a morgue and she saw the blood coming down the pipes. And she also told me that they were going to keep that bottom room in the Y with the bullet marks of that massacre as evidence to the world of what had happened. Anyway, I got back late to Seoul, and I missed the party, which was supposed to be in our honor, you know, to get the gifts, to say farewell to this lovely visit we'd paid. And so the head of the delegation had to defend one of his members, me, who had broken the law, and had a long, extensive 5-hour conversation with the church leaders of Korea, who were most upset that I had done this, because they had given, they had told the government that, of course, this is a World Council delegation, and we have advised them not to go to Gwangju and not to have anything to do with that. However, as it turned out, after 5 hours discussion, it turned out they were very glad I had done it, because they could not do that because they had to stay in Korea. I was going home. I mean, all they could do to me was ship me out the next day. And it was one of my early experiences on how the ecumenical community can really assist local churches, because there is a freedom sometimes to come in from the outside and do things which need to be done, but which local people cannot do because they have to live there and take the consequences. That was also the occasion when my Korean friend told me that they were going to continue to have such demonstrations in South Korea until such time as the International Monetary Fund quit laying their requirements for low wages and no unions on the Korean people. Well, you may know that since that time, of course, there's been growing agitation in Korea, in South Korea, and I have here an article which pleases me so much from the Globe and Mail, June the 19th, 1987, which talks about religions playing a growing role in the Korean agitation drive, and it has this wonderful little paragraph. The government is used to being opposed by pastors of the Presbyterian Republic of Korea Church. It considers that Presbyterian sect, which is connected to the United Church of Canada, a semi-subversive organization. I love it. All this is done, of course, in the name of national security. And I want to read you a poem by Cecil Rajendra, who is one of Malaysia's best-known poets. He's a member of the International Affairs Committee of the Christian Conference of Asia, because in South Korea, almost everything is justified on the basis of national security. This one is called the Animal and Insect Act. Finally, in order to ensure absolute national security, they passed the Animal and Insect Emergency Control and Discipline Act. Under this new act, buffaloes, cows, and goats were prohibited from grazing in herds of more than 3. Neither could birds, flocks, nor bees swarm. This was unlawful assembly. As they had not obtained prior planning permission, mud wasps and swallows were issued with summary notices to quit. Their homes were declared subversive extensions to private property. Monkeys were warned to stop making their noise until an official broadcasting license was issued by the appropriate ministry. Unmonitored publications and broadcasts posed the gravest threats in times of a national emergency. Similarly, woodpeckers had to stop tapping their Morse code messages from coconut trees. All messages were subject to a thorough pre-scrutiny to the relevant authorities. Java sparrows were arrested in droves for rumor mongering. Cats suspected of conspiracy had to be indoors by 9 o'clock. Cicadas and crickets received notification to turn their amplifiers down. Ducks could not quack nor turkeys gobble during restricted hours. And need I say, all dogs were muzzled. In the interest of security, penguins and zebras were ordered to discard their non-regulation uniforms. The deer had to surrender their dangerous antlers. Tigers with retracted claws were sent directly to prison for concealing lethal weapons. And by virtue of Article 4, Paragraph 2b, subsection 16, under no circumstances were elephants allowed to break wind between the hours of 6 and 6. Their farts could easily be interpreted as gunshot. It might spark off a riot. A month after the act was probably gazetted, the birds and insects started migrating south, the animals went north, and in eerie silence handcuffed the forests. There was now total national security. Following up on that, one of the things that motivates that in South Korea, of course, is the communist menace from the north. And as you know, North and South Korea are divided from each other by the most heavily armed, militarized zone anywhere in the world. There have been some overtures recently about the possibility of the reunification of North and South Korea. And I want to tell you that the churches, partly through the instrumentality of the Quakers and the World Council of Churches, have made some significant openings there. And in November of this year, there will be an all-Canada church delegation go to North Korea to meet with Christians there to attempt to be some mediators in attempting to open up that whole border and affect the peace and justice in Southeast Asia. I left more documentation on that at the back. That's one of the things I want to mention. The other, very briefly, is one of the global issues which concerns Asia particularly is the issue of international tourism. And recently there has formed out of Bangkok in Thailand the Ecumenical Association for Third World Tourism. Tourism brings in the most trade dollars of any item of world trade, and so it is an economic trade item. It has huge repercussions, particularly on the receiving countries. And Third World are now rising up and saying, we don't want to abolish it because it is a trade item, but we want trade on just in a just way, please. We want the relationship straightened out there. In the Caribbean, for example, which I know best because the whole of Niagara Peninsula goes there every winter, we're told by the Caribbean Conference of Churches that for every Canadian dollar spent, 75 cents returns to the owners of the hotels who live in Don Mills, and the 25 cents that remains is 2/3 of the national budget of the Caribbean. So the economic repercussions are very bad. Social and cultural are equally so. I mention this because they are asking for a parent response, like a partner response from churches in other parts of the world, since we are the tourist producing countries. And the Canadian Council of Churches have now responded by taking this up as an issue. In my remaining half a minute, I want to read you one other poem from Mr. Rajendra's book. This is, by the way, from a book called Songs for the Unsung, Poems on Unpoetic Issues like War and Want and Refugees. This particular one is When the Tourists Flew In. The finance minister said it will boost the economy, the dollars will flow in. The Minister of Interior said it will provide full employment. The Ministry of Culture said it will enrich our life. Contact with other cultures surely improves the texture of living. The man from the Hilton said, we will make you a second paradise. For you it is the dawn of a glorious new beginning. When the tourists flew in, our people changed into a grotesque carnival, a 2-week sideshow. When the tourists flew in, our men put aside their fishing nets to become waiters. Our women became prostitutes. When the tourists flew in, what culture we had flew out the window. We traded our customs for sunglasses and pop. We turned sacred ceremonies into 10-cent peep shows. When the tourists flew in, local food became scarce, prices went up, and our wages stayed low. When the tourists flew in, we could no longer go down to our beaches. The hotel manager said natives clutter the seashore. When the tourists flew in, the hunger and the squalor were preserved as a passing pageant for clicking cameras, a chic eyesore for shows in a church basement. When the tourists flew in, we were asked to be sidewalk ambassadors, to stay smiling, polite, to always guide the lost visitor. Hell, if we could only tell them where we really want them to go.
Thank you, Lois. I'll call on Jean Davidson now, thanks.
I have brief comments on a couple of items. Last November, I was in Cyprus for a 2-week consultation with the World Council of Churches, which brought together development people from all around the world. And the people from church agencies in Asia were particularly adamant about one aspect of our support of their work. Christians are minorities in virtually all countries in Asia, and those in minority situations are adamant that our work not just be interchurch, but interfaith as well. A few years ago, Presbyterian World Service and Development supported a small project through the World Council of Churches in Burma. And it was a cooperative effort at community development between Baptists and Buddhists. And when I talked about this at our General Assembly one year, one of the first questions was, well, what if the Buddhists get all the glory? Well, I said we were in it for the fish in the ponds, not for the glory, but that is one way in which we have to change our thinking. The Christian Conference of Asia has some pungent comments on the Asian perspective on Western development policies and perspectives. Development is not our word, says the Christian Conference of Asia. It is fraught with deep-seated problems. The Western model of development tends to be capital-intensive rather than labor-intensive, focusing on production rather than on people. The further it moves, the more it creates unemployment. The Western model of development tends towards the pollution of the environment and exhaustion of the world's limited natural resources. The Western model of development tends to erode traditional cultural values and to replace them with the dull sameness of faceless technological society. Most serious of all, the Western model of development tends to trap the poorer nations and peoples into a macro system that makes them pawns of the superpowers and victims of an unbalanced global economic system. So it's a heavy trip, but a serious message. And I think I could cite a couple of examples of where agencies do try to use appropriate technology to their circumstance in Asia, maximizing the benefits with minimum of external inputs by utilizing as much of the local resources as possible. One of those is a small project that the Presbyterian Church has supported in India, the building of some small irrigation dams in an area with monsoon rainfall. When the rains came, there was too much water. When the rains didn't come, there wasn't enough water to grow crops. These small dams were identified as a need by the people. Some graduates from the city, from Madras, came out into rural Orissa and have lived in this area for a number of years, helping to mobilize the community to talk about their problems, to identify their solutions, and to identify all of the resources that they can obtain locally before they apply for any sort of external assistance. So the work was entirely volunteer. There was a small amount of money from the Presbyterian Church in Canada for cement and for some technical advice. And the reports were exceptionally picturesque, but the underlying theme of the whole thing was that it was work that they understood was theirs. The Canadian churches have been involved in an initiative for reconciliation in Vietnam, another country that is split in two as Korea is. A couple of years ago, the Mennonites, who have played a large part in continuing any sort of contact with development in Vietnam, initiated a group of Vietnamese to come to Canada to meet church persons and to tell us stories of the way in which Vietnam is surviving after having been torn apart in decades of war. The last war is now past about a decade. And they talked about some of the devastation in the country, the bombing by the Americans of one of the foremost cancer research institutes in the world. They were doing very advanced research in liver cancer. Totally devastated. I think the most impact was made by a young woman gynecologist who talked about the incredible and horrendous birth defects that are coming from areas where Agent Orange and other defoliants and chemicals were used in the warfare. There was a return visit of Canadian church representatives last year, and their particular interest was certainly looking at the political and economic situation, but also linking with the churches. Perhaps holding out the carrot of full bilateral aid until the Vietnamese occupation of Kampuchea is resolved. But also supporting Christians there who are in a rather difficult situation by dialoguing with the government about some of the guarantees that they do have in the Vietnamese constitution for the establishment of seminaries and the other privileges of worship that are seemingly somewhat restricted. The government wants to screen all applicants to theological seminaries and to screen all candidates for ordination. However, the contention of the group was that the sort of pressure that can bring about changes in that element of religious life can only be fruitful when we are also being of positive assistance in the rebuilding of the country. I think this is another another effort where the churches have a role not only of advocacy but of reconciliation as well.
Any organization. Little did I realize a few weeks ago when we approached Bob Morris to marry us that he would have me here on front stage. It's took a bit of persuasion, but I guess I'll manage. Although I'm not representing any organization, my experience over the last 15 years has been with CUSO. I was based in Ottawa, and for those of you who may not know what CUSO does, CUSO has sort of three major areas of programming. They send trained Canadians to work overseas. They fund projects, both small and large, in third world countries, and they also do development education work in Canada. My work in Ottawa has been mostly selecting those Canadians to work in programs in Asia. However, in 1984, I had the opportunity of visiting some of our programs on the ground, and I thought I would take this opportunity to look at 2 or 3 programs that I visited. But before I go into that, I'll tell you a little bit more about myself. And my involvement in CUSO was just by chance. I was never involved in development work when I was growing up in Malaysia, but I was exposed to it, and the few recollections I have of the kind of work that was going on there were not terribly positive. Malaysia was a British colony till 1957, and once we gained independence, all the foreigners left, but soon after, new foreigners arrived. They were mostly young. The people I met were British volunteers, very keen to help. A lot of them ended up in the school system where they were not trained teachers, and a lot of them proved to be disasters as teachers. So although the contact was good, I mean, they were very keen young people willing to help, it somehow didn't seem appropriate. I was also a member of an Anglican church growing up in a small town in Malaysia, and they got food aid from, again, overseas. I'm not sure if it was the US or Canada. We would receive bags of wheat. The congregation wasn't a poor congregation, so we certainly didn't need the food, but we didn't know what to do with the wheat. If it was rice, I guess we could have used it a lot better. And I remember bringing home sacks and my mother getting out her cookbook and baking us cakes. So although the intention was there to help the needy, the poor, and the hungry, it really was in sort of middle-class homes, cakes for birthdays and so on. I also have an uncle who's a Canadian and works for an international organization. And years ago, I guess it must have been in the mid-60s, he was working for UNESCO and came to visit us. Came on home leave, but he said he was going to go visit a project that UNESCO had funded. And when I started questioning him, I discovered that UNESCO was giving funds to a Catholic school that had, in my opinion, enough funds to build their own school, and this was to build a new science lab. But what puzzled me more was that the poor did not have any access to the school. So here again was, money coming in, but not necessarily reaching the poor. Although I'm not representing CUSO here, because my experience has been with CUSO and I support what CUSO does, I'd like to talk about the 3 projects that I visited to show you that development work can work coming from the third world with people in their own countries deciding what they'd like to do, but we as Canadians can play a useful role as well. As long as we don't go into these countries sort of imposing our ideas, I think we could work very well as partners. And I'm going to just briefly describe 3 projects to show you how this can work. I'll start with Malaysia. Malaysia is a very difficult country to work in. The government is oppressive, although you may not hear about it, and that's why I'm here. It's almost impossible for social change groups to exist in Malaysia. CUSO has been involved with one such group that Murray mentioned earlier, CAP, the Consumers Association of Penang, and I had the opportunity of meeting people who work for CAP. The reason why that group functions is they started off as a consumer-type organization, sort of looking at consumer issues, but they are involved in a lot of work with the the rubber plantation workers, with fishermen, and all kinds of people, but they have to sort of hide what they do in this consumer umbrella. Now, CUSO has provided support in terms of funds. The organization exists, they do their own planning, and they decide what they would like to do. And CUSO's role has been to help them sort of financially. About a couple of years ago, there were Canadians, Wayne Elwood, who is the Canadian editor of the New Internationalist, had an idea. He had heard about CAP and was very interested in their work. And his wife, who's also is a graphic artist, was also interested. So they spent a year of their sabbatical leave with CAP, and that was their contribution. And again, this was an idea that they had thought about. It wasn't something that CAP asked for. But they came to CUSO, having heard our connection, and expressed their interest, and it worked out really well because CAP needed people with those skills. They do a lot of publications. They have their own journalists and graphic artists, but they could benefit with the sharing, and Wayne and Liz were there for a year. And that kind of thing happens all the time when you have contact with these groups. And in fact, CAP has come back now because it was so successful and asked us if we know of other people. And a professor and his wife are about to leave Ottawa on the same kind of thing. So there is a lot of opportunity for us to get involved. In Thailand, I met some farmers, paddy farmers, people who grow rice for a living, and CUSO has been involved again in another project there with the Appropriate Technology Association and the Farming Systems Institute. And what they are trying to do is to reintroduce a practice that used to happen years ago and has died down. Apparently, paddy farmers in wet rice paddy, you've got to flood the field, so there's always water in paddy growing. They used to have fish in the water, and so the fish provided a source of protein for their families, and they would have the rice that they would use for themselves and trade as well. Now that practice has died down with the introduction of pesticides. Pesticides kill the fish, and that has died down, and what the Farming Systems Institute and ATA are trying to do is to reintroduce the idea. Again, there's been CUSO involvement in terms of finance, but we've also had aquaculturists from Canada working in Thailand as CUSO volunteers with the Farming Systems Institute, doing some research. They've reintroduced ponds in the villages, and farmers are trying out this method. And in fact, I met a couple of farmers who are doing so well with the fish, they're considering quitting rice growing and just selling fish, because fish is multiplying. So again, there is this idea that has come out of Thailand, but there is opportunity for Canadian involvement. The last example is my visit to Bangladesh. I went to Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and then I was to end my visit in Bangladesh. And I sort of dreaded this most because, you hear just horror stories about Bangladesh, people starving and nothing happening, women being, having no status at all. And we don't have CUSO cooperants in Bangladesh. We made a conscious decision not to send people to countries where there are already enough people and quite capable of working. And what we'd like to do again is provide some kind of support to existing structures and groups. CUSO has been involved with a women's organization in Jessore in Bangladesh, and I went to visit the women to see what they were all about. And I was just amazed. This is a group that organizes destitute Bengali women who've been abandoned by their husbands or who've been widowed. And so they have just no status at all. They can't go home. Their families don't want them. Their in-laws don't want them. But this group, Basta Shekhar, which is Learning to Live, have gone into villages and organized these women into small clusters, groups in villages, and provided them with goats, poultry, so they could have eggs, and also given them some training in doing a kind of embroidery work that's, again, something that the women in that part of the Bangladesh do, to then sell the pieces of quilted material to gain some income. Now, they spend hours working on the embroidery, and they don't make very much in Canadian terms. But I had the privilege of meeting these women, and they would describe life before Bangladesh, before Basta Shekhar, and after. Some of them were able to build little modest homes for themselves. They were all self-sufficient, and their lives had changed just, by having a group of women who would support and getting a little bit of support in terms of buying materials, so then they could, grow their own food and have their own eggs and so on. Again, they don't need a lot, and CUSO's involvement with that group has been financial. Now, the only problem with the group is that the women are mostly illiterate, and therefore they're not sophisticated enough to write up proposals and get access to funds that might be available. And again, this is where CUSO and Interparis, another organization, Canadian organization, have helped the women get access to funds that are available in countries like Canada. So although we do not have to send Canadians over there, there is still a role that we could play, and it's a very simple role, and the women themselves are quite content in what they're doing and very happy. They've been very, very successful. When I used to meet the women, we'd have a chance to sit around and talk about their experiences, and there was one woman who was telling me how happy she was that she now was able to build a home, and her mother was living with her, and she had her own goats, and she was even able to save some money. She's a widow. So I asked her if she was thinking of remarrying, and expecting the response that, this is a Muslim society, and if you're a widow, that's it. But she sort of had this big smile on her face, and she says, things are going really well for me, so why should I? And, and I thought I was back in Canada, but here was this illiterate Bengali woman who felt, something she's never felt before, this totally self-reliant and independent. And if she married, it wouldn't be for financial support from the man that she'd do that. And it was just really refreshing for me. So I guess my message here is that there's a lot of work to be done in Asian countries, but a lot of work is being done. We don't always hear about them. We tend to focus on what's not happening. There's a lot happening, and there are ways that we as Canadians can contribute. I think the first step would be to increase our own awareness, and I see this forum as an opportunity to do that. But there are also ways of giving your own support, either financial or just moral support to the groups that are doing a fine job. Don't know how I'm doing for time. I think I'm going really well. 5 minutes. I just want to end this with
5 minutes over.
Yes, I won't. I'll only take 2 minutes. I just want to end this with a little story. I have two daughters, and the older one, when she was around 6, was watching a TV program with me. I think it was a religious organization. I'm not sure, but they were showing their project in some part in India. That was a health project. A group of very caring people would go into the villages and weigh these little kids, and the ones that weighed below a certain weight were all taken away to the center and kept there and clothed and fed for a few weeks until they gained enough weight and they were healthy, and they were sent home. And my daughter, who was 6 then, sort of looked at me and she said, "Mom, that won't work." "Won't work?" And I said, "Well, why not, Andrea?" She says, "Well, you see, when they go home, they're going to be poor again. They're not going to eat. They're going to lose all that weight. So I think they should have helped them grow their own food or something like that." And we said, she's got a lesson there, and that's what happens often when we mean well and we go in and we want to do what we think is right in terms of Canadian standards. Every child should weigh so much and so on, and you drag them out of their environment and you think you're doing a great job. I'm sure if you had gone in and spent some time with the people in the village and discussed their needs, you'd have come back with a more viable project. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena. I've been sitting here feeling increasingly troubled over the last hour because I noticed that the title of the session is Asia and the South Pacific, and I haven't heard the South Pacific mentioned. And I've just spent three years working in the South Pacific, and I feel a certain obligation to the people I've worked with over the past 3 years that they perhaps be mentioned here today. So I'll try to keep it to 5 minutes, but I would like to just maybe give a very brief overview of the situation in the South Pacific. It is an area of the world that has been forgotten. It's a bit of a backwater. It covers an enormous amount of water and very little land, and therefore very few people. There are only 6 million people in the whole South Pacific region, and about half of them live in one country, Papua New Guinea. However, it is an area of the world that, thanks to the French military police, has somewhat come back into the world's view recently as a result of the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior a couple of years ago, and all the publicity around the militarization of the region by the French and the Americans. And more recently, the coup in Fiji further revealed, if the press in Canada covered it, I don't know, the involvement of outside world powers in the Pacific region. We're all aware that the South Pacific is used by the Americans and the French as an atomic testing area. That has been the only value that the Western world seems to have had for that whole region. There are incredible stories and now more recently films about the impact of that testing on the peoples of the Pacific. When I first learned of this forum, I was hoping that I might be able to get the film produced in Australia by a filmmaker named Dennis O'Rourke called Half-Life, about the purpose of the testing and the impact on the people in the Bikini Atoll back in the 50s and what has been happening subsequent to that. I hope I can get that film in some way and bring it here and show it at some time in the next few months. But the Pacific region is remarkable in that it's the only area where 19th century colonialism and militarism still operates in the world. Because the nations are so small and so powerless relative to the Americans and the French, it is possible for those two powers to act in relation to the people there in terms that they can't get away with anywhere else. Perhaps the lack of publicity is another reason why it can take place. But the French policy in New Caledonia is 19th century colonialism pure and simple. They do not acknowledge they refuse to acknowledge the right of the indigenous people of New Caledonia to have a voice in their affairs until they had changed the population demographics to such the point that the indigenous people were a minority, and then they turned around and at that point insisted that only pure democracy would be permissible as a basis for determining the future of the country. The American militarism and colonialism are fairly linked in the areas that were an American trusteeship following World War II, Micronesia, and the Americans have been involved in a curious form of independence granting to the island nations of Micronesia, and basically they've been trading independence for trinkets and guaranteed military access to the island states in perpetuity. They've been successful in all cases but one, the island of Palau, where, unfortunately for the Americans, the people who drafted the constitution of the country put in a provision that said that the island could not be used for military purposes and atomic purposes unless 75% of the population voted in a referendum to change the Constitution. There have been 4 or 5 referendums in the last 8 or 10 years, 8, to try to get the Constitution changed. They've actually reached as high as 72% in one case, but they've never reached the magic figure of 75, and the more recent referendums, the figure has been dropping back into the low 60s. It's a very difficult struggle for the people of Palau who are opposed to the militarization of their region to try to fight the offer that is being made to the people of Palau to sell their sovereignty and their birthrights for a great deal of money and the absolute guarantee that they won't get a cent if they don't vote to turn their island into a military base. I think that it's a region that we need to be more aware of, and we need to be pressuring our government to take a stronger stand and a public stance, and that has to be vis-a-vis the United States as the major power, and France, which ironically is a government which Canada is trying to mend its fences with, following the relationship that existed between France and Canada in the time of de Gaulle. But in so doing, we are selling the people of New Caledonia short. So with that brief statement, I'm making a plea, I guess, for people to pay some attention to the South Pacific. Comments. Could I get some guidance from the forum organizers? Have you simply read the comment from each group and then directed the question to one of the panel members? How it's the comment aspect that I'm not sure of. Okay. Fine. I will direct the first question to Murray Thomson. Comment on why territorial disputes and wars are so frequent in Asia. What can be done to bring more stability and peace to the region? To what extent are the superpowers responsible for the situation? This is from groups 13 and 14.
A couple of minutes.
You and us. I don't know why there are territorial disputes so frequently in Asia. I don't know what can be done to bring more stability. And I don't know whether the superpowers are responsible or not. You want honesty? I've got honesty. For the disputes, well, you have to take them up one after the other. I mean, who is responsible? In 1965, which was declared International Cooperation Year, on the 1st of January of that year, Indonesia found itself in a war with Malaysia. They're have mostly Muslim countries. Just a little bit later on in the year, India found itself at war with Pakistan. Shortly after that, the war in Vietnam escalated. That was International Cooperation Year. It went on like that for some time. I guess you would have to look at each individual war. The India-Pakistan, I think we're all familiar with at least the basic background of the separation of India at the time that they got independence, and the hostility which has continued. And the problems between the countries were obviously a very important part of the conflict that broke out between India and Pakistan. The Vietnam War, I think we're also mostly familiar with the basic background of the war, the role that the French played, and the role that the Americans later played, and went in and escalated the war. The conflict between the North and the South, the conflict within Vietnam itself. These are all major parts of the struggle which went on in that part of the country. The Chinese at that time were supportive of Vietnam, but since then, the hostility, the historic lack of friendship between China and Vietnam reasserted itself, and now they are not friendly neighbors. And so it goes for each conflict. All I would say is that the lack of strong international organizations, the fact that we do not put our faith in the United Nations, but we put our faith in NATO and the Warsaw Pact, we put our faith basically in military pacts, weakens the whole apparatus, weakens the ability to resolve and reduce conflicts. And that's nowhere more evident than it is in Asia. One can say that the arms race since the Second World War has been a major factor, but by no means the only factor. I have sometimes done an exercise with people asking what is the basic causes of the arms race, and very soon one gets 15 to 20 basic causes. And then you ask, well, what is the fundamental basic cause of those basic causes? In a group of this size, it would be quite easy to get at least a dozen. They range from basic things such as human greed, or alienation, or sin, or some other, or something of that kind, through fear, through institutional things such as the lack of adequate organizations for resolving conflict, through the search for and the greed for scarce materials, the military-industrial complex, the foreign policy of the Soviet Union, the foreign policy of the United States, and the historic rivalries and national hostilities and so on. So basically, as I say, I don't know the causes of each individual one. I do know that we must build a global community which reduces the likelihood, will not eliminate them, but reduces the chances and provides more opportunities and more incentive for collaboration. And we have a lot of those in place right now, but not nearly enough of them. Well, that's a 3-minute response.
Okay, we've got quite a number of questions. I don't think with the time we've left that we're really going to be able to have sort of supplementary questions and answers. The next group came up with 3 questions instead of 1. Is there any reason for hope in the Philippines? Okay.
You're on.
I think there's hope as far as the people themselves are concerned. I think as far as the government, Cory Aquino's government is concerned, it's pretty iffy. But the people are so resilient, I just think that they will work out something themselves. I mean, that's the only thing I can say. They have a multitude of organizations which work, and while right now things are pretty scary for a lot of them, they don't have much chance of meeting in the smaller areas because of the intimidation by these groups. But I'm sure they'll find a way. But I'm afraid I haven't got anything specific I can say.
If I could abuse the chair again, I could amplify what Gay has just said. I spent 2 weeks in the Philippines in May of this year, and that was at the period when the senatorial elections were taking place. The electoral abuses and the manipulations which took place within Cory Aquino's own grouping led the Filipino organizations that I was meeting at the time to be rather cynical about the future in terms of politics. But my own assessment in terms of that organization and other organizations like it and the Filipino people that we met with left me with a tremendous sense of optimism ultimately that the level of understanding that these organizations had of the situation not only in their own country but globally, and the way in which they were able to work in both the military situation that they'd faced prior to the revolution and now in a different, in some ways more complex situation after. It certainly made me as a CUSO staff person very humble. They knew a lot more than I did about how the game works. So I left with quite a bit of optimism for the Philippines in the long run. Lois Wilson, please comment on what is going on with the Christian church in China and the ecumenical movement there.
How many minutes? One could say a great deal about the Christian community in China. Its present operation really comes out of the history of mission vis-a-vis the Western world in China, where numerous attempts by both Catholics and Protestants, I think the Catholics have had 4 attempts, the Protestants mostly in the 18th, 19th century, to really plant the Christian cause there, and for various reasons have been evicted. One of the reasons was the very close tie that Christian missions had with economic matters, with the unequal treaties which the British forced upon China, and that bad historical memory. One of my visits to China, I saw a play which was based on the Boxer Rebellion years and following, which was called The Church is for Burning. And the climax of the play was the church was burnt. So there is a fair hostility in the culture to the whole history of Christian mission. At the present time, having come through, the church has survived both the revolution of 1949 and also the Cultural Revolution of the 60s and late 70s. The church now operates within the constitution of the state, which promises to protect freedom of religion. And there was a significant change made in the Constitution in the last few years, because it used to be also the freedom not to practice religion, and that has now been taken out. So that these kind of, I didn't find in China the same constitutional thing that they have in Russia, which is the freedom of the state to propagate atheism. So there is an attempt, I think the religious communities are looked upon, well, and they are very minority, there are hardly any people, and so they are treated as minorities and seen in that sense. However, we got the sense from the Christians we met with that the state seriously does try to protect that right. So they work within strict limits. On the other hand, many Christians, both Protestant and Catholic, support the goals of the revolution and support what has happened there. In the Protestant community, this is known as the Three Self movement, which has got long historic roots in China, but has now been embraced by the China Christian Council, which brings all Protestant communities together, everything from the little flock who really want to return to New Testament days and are resisting any national expression of Christian community, to the Patriotic Church, which is the Catholic equivalent. Both these are movements, that is, they are not the official church, but they are movements which attempt to influence the churches to be fully Chinese, self-supporting, self-governing, and self-propagating. We found that there are tensions, of course, in both Protestant and Catholic communities. Within the Protestant community, there are the ones who do not believe in that, in being self-supporting, self-governing, self-propagating, and would therefore look to financial help, particularly from the fundamentalist evangelical wing of the Christian community. And they are the ones who smuggle Bibles into China and beam prayers into China via satellite and so on. And the Three Self movement are very disgruntled by this movement and wish they'd stop. And as you know, there is tension within the Catholic community with the Vatican as to the validity of the ordination of bishops and the continuity there. The China Christian Council, which I said is really an umbrella group bringing the Protestants together, talks about itself as being post-denominational and post-liberation. They talk about themselves being post-liberation because they feel that China is well on the way now to delivering many of the social benefits that we've talked about all these things this weekend. Feeling that in China, most people are not hungry anymore. They are looking to housing, and many of the social benefits of the gospel or the goals of the gospel they feel have been achieved or are in process. In terms of post-denomination, they affirm the former denominational practices and loyalties of all members. So, for example, I said, well, what do you teach in your theological colleges, because they have theological colleges now? And they said, well, we affirm baptism by immersion, we affirm baptism by sprinkling, we affirm, And it reminded me of my mother, who was quite a good theologian, who said to me, Lois, it doesn't really matter whether you dunk them or sprinkle them, they all turn out the same. So here they are but there's an immense tolerance and affirmation of the various Christian traditions in that area. I'll be through in a moment. One of the main problems is they have so many converts now that they can't keep up with the catechetical work. That is, they are converts, but they don't know anything about what it means to be a disciple. And the leadership is mostly over 70. The theological seminarians are mostly out of high school, age 17, and you've got this massive gap. What happened is the middle-aged people got sent to the rural areas during the Cultural Revolution, stayed there, and are no longer in the churches very much. So their main problem is leadership. The most creative thing I saw was in Nanjing Theological Seminary, which is the main Protestant seminary, where it is mandatory for students not only to study theology, but to study Chinese art, traditional Chinese art. And the best ones then have to take more postgraduate work in art, because what they want to do is express gospel themes in the artistic secular field, so that people who never darken a church door will still see the gospel message. And I thought, my goodness, that's a lesson for Canada.
Third question for Group 11 and 12. Korea, is the automotive industry going to do anything about the low wages paid to the Hyundai workers, therefore affecting the lives of workers in Japan, US, Canada, and Germany?
Is who going to?
Is the automotive industry, I don't know if that's ours or theirs.
I don't know, and certainly I don't think they won't without some pressure. I mean, maybe there are others who can speak to that. I've never known anybody raise wages voluntarily. Have you? No.
You're really speaking to the fact that unless our unions in Canada and the United States start to put pressure on their governments.
Yeah. Well, there are already riots in South Korea, as you know, in the factories there for higher wages, because they've got a bit of a space because of the whole thing that's been happening in the last 2 weeks, so that there would be pressure also from South Korea.
And what we need to do is have our unions here supporting that instead of people just wanting to buy cheap cars, starting to point out the fact that cheap cars come at a price.
Yeah, I would say that isn't the unions that need the support here so much as the consumers.
The unions are consumers, and they are also able to get the money to put forward this kind of voice for consumers.
Well, my experience of the International Labor Union is that there's excellent solidarity. And so I would assume that there would be union solidarity. What I think there won't be solidarity is those of us who have to buy the cars and don't want to pay a higher price if they're getting union wages.
What can Canadians do financially or morally to support the stand taken by the people of Palau? In addition, is there any way we can support those other islands which have agreed to military use of their land, should they wish to reverse the agreements they have with the U.S. and France? You're probably best qualified to answer that one, Murray.
Well, I don't know if they're qualified. Again, I think it's related to Canadian efforts, and I'm sure there have been many efforts in this area to push the concept of nuclear weapon-free zone and to get our Canadian government to give strong support to the nuclear weapon-free zone of the Pacific and the efforts of the people in the Pacific to identify the problems which they have been facing for so long. This also, of course, suggests that we in Canada should be supporting nuclear weapon-free zone for Canada, at least for the Arctic. Those would be two very specific things that we could do, because it would demonstrate that we're not just asking for other areas to become nuclear weapons-free, but that we want to see our own area become nuclear weapons-free. And that will involve some real changes in the perception of power struggles in the world and changes in our own policies vis-a-vis the United States and the United Nations. Now, there must be other thoughts on that, too.
I've been away for 6 years. Has any of the municipalities or regional districts in this area declared themselves a nuclear-free zone? If not, we could do so.
Yes, they have.
Good.
City of Kelowna has.
Okay, moving right along. How can we keep ourselves from becoming unwitting allies of the military-industrial complex, both at home and abroad? Any volunteers for this one?
How do we become part of the military-industrial complex? Unwitting.
How to keep ourselves from becoming unwitting allies of the military-industrial complex?
Can I say that?
Yes.
Again, there have been various efforts by the churches, Project Ploughshares, and others to try to get the government to provide us with information Where are our arms experts going? My colleague Ernie Regier with Ploughshares has been trying for years now to obtain from the Canadian government, through the access to information, specific information about our exports of military commodities. And all he's been getting back have been piles of white sheets of paper with no information on them. It is not possible to know specifically where our arms exports go. We could be and should be pushing harder for an arms registry by the United Nations. This would, again, help not only this country, but many other countries. We should be familiar with the Disarmament and Development Conference starting in 10 days' time in New York. Again, and this is another opportunity for all of us who are concerned about disarmament and development and the linkage to push for the main recommendations which have come from the United Nations in this field. One of the main ones has been to ask all of the governments to do a study of how our economies could be converted from military-oriented to civilian-oriented efforts. The only country that has done that so far, has begun it in important ways, has been Sweden. And we have conveniently ducked the question whenever it's been brought up. What we are doing, of course, is we're pushing the conversion in the opposite direction. Last year, our government put $185 million of our taxpayers' funds into efforts by industry to convert from civilian to military commodity production. And that amount has been going up every year for the last 5 years. So there is a very specific area that we could look at in order to reduce our own emphasis on military production, and as well as to relate to an UN effort, which is a worldwide effort, to try to cut back on military transfers, which indirectly would help Asia.
Marty, the influence of the arms race since the Second World War has been based on the supposed threat of the Soviet Union to the so-called free world. I think that the arms race continues. Well, I'm satisfied that the arms race continues because in Canada's case, most Canadians accept this premise that we have to be well armed and prepared, even to the extent of supporting the nuclear weapons proliferation in the world, to protect ourselves from the communist menace, the evil empire that we're so often told about. Until certainly the people of North America, where I think the true roots of the arms race lie, until the people are themselves try and educate themselves about the threat of communism, we will never break the circle of the arms race. It's academic at this point to argue about where it started and who did what first, because we know we get those arguments about all the time, and I think to a large extent they're true. The Soviet Union makes one advance, and the Americans try and duplicate it or better it. The evidence, I think, does lie on the fact that the Americans have made the biggest steps and have been followed by the Soviet Union.